Can a person who commits an unforgivable crime genuinely transform? Or are some actions so terrible that redemption becomes impossible? In 1983, a young woman named Carla Faye Tucker entered a Houston apartment carrying a pickaxe. By the time she left, 2 people were dead. The violence was so shocking that many believed there was only one appropriate punishment: death. But years later, the same woman once described as a monster became one of the most controversial figures on America's death row. She claimed she had changed. She spoke about faith, regret, and a completely different person from the woman who committed those murders. And then something almost impossible happened. People who had spent their lives supporting the death penalty began asking the state of Texas to spare her. A pope intervened. Politicians demanded mercy. Religious leaders joined the campaign. And the brother of one of her victims, someone who once wanted her executed, became one of her strongest defenders. But behind all the debate was one question that had no easy answer. Was Carla Faye Tucker truly transformed? Or was the world being asked to forgive something that could never be forgiven? This is the story of a crime that shocked Houston, a woman who became a symbol of redemption, and a final decision that divided millions. Before Carla Faye Tucker became one of America's most famous death row inmates, she was a young woman whose life had already begun to spiral. Born in Texas in 1959, Carla grew up in a troubled environment. Her childhood was marked by instability, and by her teenage years she had entered a world of rebellion, drugs, and dangerous relationships. As a teenager, she became involved in the rock and roll lifestyle of the 1970s, traveling and experimenting with drugs. But behind the image of a rebellious young woman was someone whose life was becoming increasingly uncontrolled. By the early 1980s, addiction had taken hold. And on the night of June 13, 1983, that downward path led her to an apartment in Northwest Houston. She was not alone. She arrived with 2 men, including her boyfriend at the time, Daniel Garrett. Inside the apartment was a man named Jerry Dean. But what happened inside the apartment would become one of the most disturbing murder cases in Texas history. Inside the apartment was not only Jerry Dean. Also present was Deborah Thornton, a 32-year-old woman who happened to be there that night. Investigators later determined that both victims were attacked with a pickaxe. Jerry Dean was killed first. Deborah Thornton, who was hiding in the apartment, was also found dead. The crime scene shocked investigators. It was not simply the fact that 2 people had been murdered. It was the level of violence involved. And as details of the crime began to emerge, public anger grew. But while the evidence painted a horrifying picture of what happened, there was one question investigators still needed to answer. After the murders were discovered, police quickly began piecing together what happened inside the apartment. The investigation led them to Carla Faye Tucker and her boyfriend, Daniel Garrett. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Authorities found that the pair had been connected to the crime scene, and witnesses helped investigators understand the events leading up to the murders. But the most shocking part was not only what police discovered. It was what Carla herself later admitted. During questioning, Tucker confessed to her involvement in the killings. Her words and the details of the crime would become a major part of the prosecution's case. The trial that followed would focus on one central issue. Was Carla Faye Tucker a dangerous killer who deserved the harshest punishment possible? Or was she a deeply troubled person whose life had been destroyed by years of addiction and poor choices? The courtroom would soon become the place where those 2 opposing views collided. In 1984, Carla Faye Tucker went on trial for the murders of Jerry Dean and Deborah Thornton. The prosecution presented a picture of a violent crime committed by someone who showed little regard for human life. The defense argued that Tucker's background, addiction, and troubled upbringing played an important role in understanding how she ended up there. But after hearing the evidence, the jury reached its decision. Carla Faye Tucker was found guilty of murder. Her sentence was death. At that moment, her future appeared certain. She would spend the rest of her life waiting for an execution date. For many people, the story was over. A crime had been committed. A conviction had been reached. A punishment had been decided. But what happened next would transform Carla Faye Tucker from a convicted murderer into one of the most debated prisoners in America. Because on death row, something began to change. The woman who entered prison as a symbol of violence would eventually become known around the world as a symbol of redemption. But was that change real? And could a person who committed such a terrible crime ever truly be forgiven? When Carla Faye Tucker arrived on death row, many people saw her as someone who had reached the end of the road. She had been convicted of 2 murders. A jury had sentenced her to death. And for many Texans, the case was finished. But behind the prison walls, something unexpected began to happen. Carla Faye Tucker started to change. The woman who entered prison struggling with addiction and anger began studying the Bible and speaking about faith, regret, and personal transformation. She described herself as a completely different person from the young woman who committed the murders years earlier. Over time, her story began attracting attention from religious groups and prison reform advocates. People who met her said they saw someone who appeared remorseful and committed to changing her life. But not everyone believed the transformation. For many, the question remained: could someone truly become a different person after committing such a violent crime? Or was this simply a last attempt to escape punishment? During her years on death row, Carla Faye Tucker became known for more than the crime that put her there. She became known for her faith. She married a prison minister named Dana Brown while still incarcerated, and she continued speaking publicly about her spiritual transformation. Her supporters argued that the person who sat in prison in the 1990s was not the same person who committed the murders in 1983. They pointed to her behavior behind bars, her religious commitment, and her expressions of remorse as evidence that she had changed. But opponents saw the situation differently. They believed that some crimes carried consequences that could not be erased by personal change. To them, the victims had been permanently lost, and the punishment should reflect the seriousness of that loss. The debate around Carla Faye Tucker was no longer only about one murder case. It had become a national argument about justice, forgiveness, and whether rehabilitation should matter after a crime as severe as murder. As Carla Faye Tucker's execution date approached, her case moved far beyond Texas. People around the world began following her story. Religious leaders, activists, and politicians joined the debate over whether Texas should grant clemency. One of the most notable voices calling for mercy came from the Vatican. Pope John Paul II became associated with appeals for clemency in the case, reflecting the broader opposition to her execution from some religious groups. Supporters argued that executing Tucker would ignore the possibility that people can genuinely change. They believed her transformation represented the very reason mercy exists. But those who supported the execution argued that the focus had shifted too much toward Tucker herself and away from the 2 people who had lost their lives. Jerry Dean and Deborah Thornton could never return. and their families would carry the consequences forever. As the debate intensified, one unexpected voice emerged. Someone whose connection to the case was impossible to ignore. The brother of one of Karla Faye Tucker's victims. And what he said would surprise many people watching the story unfold. As the debate over Karla Faye Tucker's fate grew louder, most of the attention focused on one person, Karla Faye Tucker herself. Her supporters spoke about her faith. Her opponents spoke about the murders. But there was another perspective that many people struggled to understand. The perspective of the victims' families. And then came a development that surprised many observers. Ron Carlson, the brother of one of Tucker's victims, Deborah Thornton, became one of the people asking the state of Texas to spare her life. It was a position that challenged the way many people viewed the case. For some, forgiveness from a victim's family member represented the strongest argument for mercy. If someone directly connected to the tragedy could forgive, they argued, perhaps society should consider forgiveness as well. But others disagreed. They believed that while personal forgiveness was meaningful, the justice system had a separate responsibility. The question became even more complicated. If a victim's family member can forgive, does that mean the state should also forgive? As the execution date approached, the fight to save Karla Faye Tucker's life intensified. Her supporters continued making appeals, arguing that her transformation was genuine and that executing her would ignore the possibility of redemption. They pointed to the years she had spent in prison and the person they believed she had become. But Texas officials faced a different responsibility. The courts had already reviewed the case. The conviction had stood. The sentence had been decided. And now the final decision rested with Texas Governor George W. Bush, who had the authority to approve or deny clemency. The governor received thousands of letters from people on both sides of the issue. Some begged for mercy. Others demanded that the sentence be carried out. The entire country watched as the final decision approached. For Karla Faye Tucker, there was no longer a courtroom battle. No more trials. No more appeals. Only one question remained. Would Texas allow her to live? On February 3, 1998, Karla Faye Tucker entered the final hours of her life. The woman who had spent nearly 15 years on death row had become one of the most recognizable prisoners in America. To her supporters, she represented the power of change. To her critics, she represented a crime that could never be undone. Both sides believed they were defending justice. Shortly before her execution, Tucker continued expressing remorse for the murders and spoke about her faith. But the state of Texas did not change its decision. At approximately 6:45 p.m., Karla Faye Tucker was executed by lethal injection. She became the first woman executed in Texas since the Civil War era. Her death ended one of the most controversial death penalty debates in modern American history. But it did not end the question her case had raised. Because decades later, people are still asking the same thing. Can someone who committed an unforgivable crime truly transform? Karla Faye Tucker's story remains one of the most complicated chapters in America's debate over crime and punishment. To some, she was a person who genuinely changed and deserved another chance. To others, she was someone whose actions caused an irreversible loss that could never be undone. Her case forced millions of people to confront an uncomfortable question. Is justice about giving people the punishment they deserve, or should it also consider the possibility that people can become someone different from who they once were? There may never be a simple answer. but we want to hear your thoughts. Do you believe Carla Faye Tucker's transformation should have changed her fate? Or do you believe the severity of her crime meant the sentence should stand? Share your opinion in the comments. If you found this story thought-provoking, subscribe for more true stories that explore the moments where crime, justice, and human nature collide.